Well, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Roz Engel, and I'm president of the World Affairs Council of New Jersey. We're one of the newest councils in the national network. We got started in 2019, proud to serve the great and very global state of New Jersey. We're excited today to be partnering with our sister council, the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, on today's program, Radicalization and Terrorism in the Digital Age. This afternoon, we have Nick Rasmussen joining us to share his insights and deep expertise on the threats posed by online radicalization and violent extremism. During his highly distinguished career in government that ran from before 2001 to 2017, Nick held senior counterterrorism posts at the White House and in the U.S. intelligence community. He concluded his government career as director of the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC, leading more than 1,000 professionals from across the intelligence community, federal government, and the federal contractor workforce. Over his career, Nick has served in 3 administrations, including as special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism at the NSC. And in the decade prior to 2001, he was in the State Department focused on the Middle East. But in the what's next part of Nick's career, he has gone on to lead the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, the GIFCT, a research policy and coordinating platform that brings together the technology industry, government, civil society, and academics to foster collaboration and information sharing. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And we'll get into questions in just a sec. I just want to let people know we're going to talk for about 45 minutes with some questions that Nick and I will go through, and then we'll open up to audience questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Nick, you could put them into Q&A, and I'll be looking at those a little bit later and finding some good ones to ask him. All right, so terrorism today. The country's just finished a month of 9/11 remembrances. And in the New York metropolitan area, those remembrances are particularly resonant. Just in New Jersey, it was the second most affected state in the country on that day. So I was hoping we could open with maybe a few kind of scene setting questions just to help put things into context. How has terrorism changed over the last 20 years? I know it's a big question, but we could kind of just open it up with some thoughts. Where do you think it's more sort of heading? And how does the forum fit into that picture?
Great questions all, Roz. And first, I'm really happy to be here with the New Jersey World Affairs Council. It's a privilege to do that. We are at kind of a unique moment in the history of those of us who work on terrorism and counterterrorism and extremism issues, because again, we've just had this 20th anniversary milestone, thinking about, at least from an American perspective, or a narrowly American perspective, that caused a lot of us to step back and ask, what does it all mean? Where have we come? Where are we in this narrative? And my first post-COVID chance to travel anywhere was to New York City a few weeks ago, where I attended a conference held by NYPD. And of course, that gave me the chance to walk the grounds at the museum, at the 9/11 museum. And there's no better way to kind of put it all in context and what it meant to those who live in the greater New York metropolitan area, including New Jersey, than to do just that. So I've had a lot of time to think about these issues recently. And I think I think of it on a kind of as a ledger. On the positive side of the ledger, we have done so much as a country to keep ourselves safer from terrorist attack. We've built up such a tremendous defensive infrastructure. Everything from what you see at TSA when you try to travel, across the United States, or what you might see at the border if you were re-entering the United States after travel abroad, but also the various institutions that we've strengthened and enhanced in the period since 9/11. Including the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where I worked, where you of course are well familiar as well. A lot of those government institutions we strengthened and invested in and made to make ourselves safer. So we in effect built up a much more sophisticated, layered defensive posture that allows us to be safer, particularly from the kind of large scale mass casualty catastrophic attack that Al-Qaeda was able to mount against the United States. That sits on the good side of the ledger. And even that I wouldn't say is entirely without flaw. Did we do that in every way efficiently, spending every last dollar as efficiently and as wisely as we might have over those decades? Of course not. Billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment have gone into that. but largely positively, I would say we are a harder target for the terrorist bad guy to hit, but certainly that terrorist bad guy operating in an overseas environment. On the negative side of the ledger, though, what I would point to is just the way in which extremist narratives more easily travel, transit, and proliferate in the online environment now than perhaps 20 years ago. 20 years ago, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I was working at the White House under President Bush at the National Security Council, and we were focused like a laser on places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, places in East Africa, North Africa, all of which were physical safe havens for individuals who were parts of terrorist groups or who had a terrorist or an extremist, a violent extremist mindset. And it was all about rooting out those safe havens and eliminating those safe havens. Well, as the last 20 years have played out, physical safe havens, while still very much a problem, and all you have to do is think about the recent policy debate about withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we can talk about that if our guests are interested in talking about that. But physical safe haven is only part of the problem. It's the virtual safe haven that allows so much of today's terrorist threat to manifest and grow and to proliferate, all of those things we worry about. Now you don't need to gather in person with someone in order to commune or collude or conspire with an individual to carry out an attack or to share an extremist or terrorist narrative or to recruit or raise money or any of the different factors or elements that go into terrorist activity. You can do that in a sheltered online environment. And again, the organization I'm a part of now is one of those organizations that is now dedicated to trying to reduce or shrink the amount of square footage available in the online environment to terrorists and violent extremists. So I'd sum up by saying we're safer in some respects, Raz, but in some ways the environment is so much more complicated and messy than it was even 20 years ago. And I haven't even mentioned domestic extremism or right-wing extremism or any of the other forms of extremism, racially and ethnically based or motivated forms of hatred. All of those add to a complicated threat landscape. We're not just worrying about groups like the Islamic State, ISIS, or Al-Qaeda. My successors in government have a much more 360-degree threat spectrum to worry about when it comes to extremist and terrorist narratives. They're spending as much time on people here in the United States who 20 years ago we wouldn't have thought of as terrorists, but now we would, as they are spending time thinking about individuals operating in places like Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia or Mali or other parts of East and North Africa. So that's how I look at it, Roz. There's a lot of good, but there's a lot to give you pause. And I guess the very last thing I'd say is terrorism also now sits in a national security landscape where it's not job one anymore. For most of the post 9/11 period, as you know from your own time in government, it was at the top of the list. You didn't have to do much to get attention to counterterrorism issues. Now, of course, we worry about climate change. We worry about cyber attacks. We worry about state competition from the likes of Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and the threats that they pose. Terrorism is just one of the big problem sets on the agenda for our national security leadership. And it's hard to be single-minded and single-threaded in that kind of environment when you've got that wide an array of threats to worry about.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. That was a great way to kind of just tee up a bunch of different things. And why don't we maybe delve a little bit more into the online, kind of the unique aspects of the online environment. And I think,
Sure.
I think on the website, you linked to a recent UK study, and it looked at, I thought it was really interesting. It looked at like hundreds of people who'd been convicted of extremist offenses in England and Wales. And it found that prior to 2005, about 83% of extremists have been radicalized in face-to-face meetings. But by 2015 to 2017, that figure had dropped to like less than 20%. So the vast majority of radicalization is happening either in these kind of hybrid face-to-face and online, but I think it said a quarter were basically radicalized completely online. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what does that look like? What is online radicalization? Is there some playbook? Who's susceptible? Where is it happening online? What does that look like?
Great questions all, Roz, and not simple answers either. Because again, this goes back to some of my work in government before I left government service a few years ago. We were trying to do exactly that, figure out, is there a single playbook by which someone becomes radicalized in the online environment? And of course, there are sometimes similar factors. There can be either personality factors or mental health factors or environmental factors that all make one or another person more or less susceptible to online radicalization. But unfortunately, there wasn't really a single, aha, here's how it happens step by step. What we could say, though, I think with confidence, was that the process of online radicalization is significantly more accelerated than in-person radicalization. And that's not hard to understand. Individuals spend a lot of time in front of their keyboards. And so if you do begin to delve into some radical or violent extremist narrative, and you begin to kind of go down that pathway can be pretty quick if you're sitting there alone in front of your computer and able to interact with like-minded individuals or individuals who will try to draw you into that environment. Before, again, any kind of more traditional forms of radicalization required, as you described it, more in-person connectivity. So you would need to, in a sense, physically travel somewhere, find other like-minded people, become part of a cell or a grouping, and together go down that journey to a radical or extremist place together. Now that can be all done, of course, from your keyboard, and that just accelerates that process. And that's true regardless of what ideology you're talking about. You could be talking about an Islamist, extremist, jihadist ideology, the kinds of narratives that drive members of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State to engage in terrorist activity. But the same could be true of individuals driven by ideologies tied to white supremacy, anti-Semitism, other forms of racially or ethnically motivated extremist behavior. And I guess the last thing I'd say about the online environment and extremism is, when I was in government, our usual best way to get tipped or triggered that an individual might be headed in that direction was not through government monitoring. It wasn't because the government was going to be looking into your computer and figuring out who was doing what online. There are just limits as to what government can do, and there should be limits as to what government can do. The vast majority of the domestic extremists here in the United States that our law enforcement authorities got a handle on before something bad happened came from bystanders, individuals who knew them, who recognized that something was amiss, who could alert law enforcement, or unfortunately sometimes afterwards say, aha, I wish I'd acted because I'd seen something happening and I didn't act on it. We used to call it the bystander phenomenon. Easily 75% of the cases we documented at the National Counterterrorism Center domestically, there was always someone in that 75% of cases who raised their hand in the aftermath and said, I knew something, I sensed something, I saw something, and I wish I'd acted on it. And so I think that puts us all in the position of having to be attentive to individuals who might be susceptible to radicalization, and then trying to intervene if they see that happening. It's a challenge because, again, that kind of behavior won't always be obvious or available for law enforcement to see or act upon.
Great. So I think maybe if we could also talk a little bit about, you sometimes read here about, say, like a galvanizing event, a trigger, something that really agitates and accelerates, say, the process of radicalization, or tips somebody into radicalization. And there's another piece on the website that I liked, but I think I like it because it just kind of gets at this question of triggers. And it was talking about COVID, another thing we're living through right now, right? But the impact of COVID on online extremist posting behavior as a trigger for extremist rhetoric. And it made a couple claims. One was that the far right remains very positioned to exploit the pandemic. And that actually the other threat isn't just from the far right, but is from incel extremists, involuntary celibates, who've also kind of gotten a little bit energized by COVID and are clearly reacting to it. So could you maybe talk us through, I know it's a little bit weird, but how COVID can kind of trigger the kind of rhetoric and extremist posting behavior? And do you see that as related to other things, other events around the world that we should think about as triggers. So how do we think about a trigger and how people react to it?
So the COVID question is a great one because I think it certainly applies here in the United States. It's also something that was obviously a global phenomenon. So there's not a single country in the world that hasn't been impacted by this pandemic. And I think what we've seen across all of the different forms of extremism is that COVID has proven to be something that can be an accelerator. It can allow, extremist groups, terrorist groups thrive when they can build a compelling narrative about how an individual or a group is somehow being kept down or oppressed or victimized by some other group. And the COVID set of facts plays nice or can play nicely into that for literally almost any group you can think of. So if you're a far right anti-government extremist, or at least you tend to think that way, whether you're in the United States or somewhere else, and you look at the set of public health measures that the government is now mandating, you must wear a mask, you must change your behavior in these ways, you're not allowed to go here, you can't leave the country, you can't enter another country. It's very easy to kind of put those public health measures, which most of us would see as common sense measures by government designed to keep us safe and to try to bring the pandemic to a swifter conclusion, but they can be portrayed as overreach by the government, symptomatic of what we already know about the government, which is that it is out to limit or even eliminate personal freedom. So that's just one example of the way in which the COVID set of facts can be used to shape a narrative, and not just for groups like far-right extremists either. In some of the early days of COVID, I remember seeing reporting about the way in which some of the Islamic terrorist organizations were portraying what governments were doing in response to COVID. They were saying that, painting pictures of governments using a disease as a means of attacking Muslim populations, that the vaccine distribution was not uniform across the world, for example. And so Muslim countries were disadvantaged in their efforts to gain either therapeutic medicines or access to vaccines. And that was a way of showing that there was Muslim bias and that Muslim communities were being victimized by the West. And of course, that is a narrative that has always been a part of the terrorist extremist narrative that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State use. And so again, grabbing onto the set of facts that allows you to advance your extremist narrative is a kind of a time-tested terrorism tactic. And then again, COVID also, as we talked about earlier, Roz, it left everybody in front of their keyboards for that many more hours every day. And it just increased the degree to which online extremism could be accelerated because people were spending more time in that potentially toxic environment. And then the last thing that COVID did to kind of make life easier for terrorists and violent extremists is that it took a lot of attention away from traditional counterterrorism work that governments were doing around the world. As governments, as you certainly know from your own experience, it's hard for governments to do massive things all at once, or several massive things all at once. And as our federal government and many other governments around the world shifted into pandemic response mode, that drew resources and attention away in many instances from traditional counterterrorism work in places, in conflict zones around the world, whether it's Africa or the Middle East or South Asia. So terrorists in some ways were, I wouldn't say left alone, but they were facing less pressure from government counterterrorism work of the sort they might ordinarily have been experiencing. So all of that together provided a bit of an advantage to various terrorist and extremist groups. Incels was the last place you started with your question, and this is a head scratcher because this is when we who think about extremism and violent extremism and terrorism think about incels, it's hard to get our arms around this because this is not a movement that's based around group affiliation. There's nobody walking around with a badge or a lanyard or an ID card that says they are an incel. They are self-identified, self-selected individuals who commune with each other in an online setting and occasionally an in-person setting. And it's mostly done, that communing and that colluding, around a set of hateful, toxic ideas, all tied to misogyny, all tied in many cases to their own personal experience as so-called involuntary celibates, individuals who have found themselves outside of the circle of normal male-female relationships, that normal, healthy male-female relationships. And as a result, they've constructed a narrative in which they are victimized by particularly women in this environment. And that leads them to seek to find ways to strike back and to assert their own dominance in that environment. And all of that, as I said, has largely taken place in an online environment. And as a result, it doesn't have geographical borders. An incel can be just as persuaded to become, or a person can be persuaded to align with themselves with that ideology by someone they're connecting with at literally any place in the globe who would have a similar experience, whether you're in Australia or Tokyo or London or Los Angeles. And I guess one other thing I would say about the incel movement is somewhat characteristic of other forms of online extremism, and it's something we struggled with in government, is how do you determine whether someone is just being extremist in their online engagement versus how, if they're engaged in offline real world harm. Obviously, neither is a good thing, but if you're law enforcement, you want to focus your resources on the individuals. You want the FBI and local police to be identifying and working to interrupt individuals who are at risk of taking what they're doing online and carrying it into the real world offline environment. And it's by and large a relatively small percentage. Not everybody who does hateful things online acts on those and ends up being a murderous terrorist or looking to carry out an attack or do something awful. But how do you figure out who is that? What is the subset of that online extremist population who is most at risk of activating and doing something offline? And that is particularly hard, I would imagine, in the incel environment, because again, you lack the group dynamic of in-person dynamic. And again, so often when we were disrupting groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the point at which we in government, law enforcement or intelligence or military would have success would be when they would have to gather in person or when they would have to communicate with each other and make arrangements to do things in the physical world, because that of course gives government, law enforcement a much greater opportunity to interrupt or get in the middle of that. It's much harder in the online environment to get in the middle of that conversation because we're obviously looking to respect freedom of speech and freedom of engagement. It's only when that translates into real world harm that the government can be more aggressive in its tactics.
Great. So I think we've talked a little bit about the threat. So maybe we could move to a little bit more sanguine or optimistic in the sense of trying to understand what tools we have. So you mentioned right up front that the U.S. government, for one, has made a lot of important investments in improving security and in developing sort of counter-terrorist capability, intelligence authorities, other things. So could you talk a little bit about how well positioned we are, though, to deal with this online threat? So having gone from the threat that we had 20 years ago and then reacting to that and building out capabilities, to address that threat, how well positioned do you think we are in the online radicalization? Do we have the right tools to both prevent and also maybe respond to terrorist or extremist attacks that are originating online?
Great question. And again, when we hit the 20th anniversary of 9/11 recently, it was something that was much on my mind, and because of the way in which the threat has changed. And I actually published a piece on a forum called Just Security that NYU's law school publishes. And they did a series of kind of 20th anniversary 9/11 pieces. And one of the arguments I put forward in that context was, in light of the current threat that we face, what we need to focus on is developing more whole of society strategies to deal with counterterrorism, rather than focusing on whole of government strategies. I spent most of my career in government trying to make sure the government was knit together well and was integrating its efforts, that the military and the intelligence community and the law enforcement community and the diplomatic community were all harmonized. I mean, all that work, all those years I spent operating in the White House Situation Room or with colleagues, trying to make sure that we were coordinating as a government to make ourselves maximally effective in counterterrorism work. Well, that's all great. But if you're talking about the online environment, the government is only a slice of the story. And because so much of that infrastructure where the online environment exists, all of that infrastructure, of course, is privately held and run by companies. And so the argument I put forward in this piece was not particularly, I would say, wise or insightful. Maybe it was just pretty damn obvious. But what we need is our counterterrorism strategies that bring together the whole of society. And so that whole of society means government, to be sure, but it also means the private sector, making the companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, all part of the conversation and the strategy to defeat online extremism. But not even just private sector and government. We also need academia. You pointed to several of the academic insights that my colleagues at GIFCT have put forward in our global network on extremism and technology. We pump out academic insights to try to point ourselves in the right directions all the time. And then lastly, there's this whole cluster of civil society voices and organizations that need to be part of this terrorism and counterterrorism work in the online environment. Because when you think about terrorism in the online environment, it is certainly possible to overcorrect and overachieve in our counterterrorism work. We could, of course, make the online environment safer by having a heavily censored online environment, by limiting the ability of people to engage in free expression and free association in the online environment. So now when I think about strategies to deal with terrorism in the online environment, we have to do multiple things. We have to go aggressively after those who are in the online environment who are looking to do extremist or terrorist related things, but we have to do so while not also limiting the free speech, the ability of individuals to engage on the internet freely with each other as individuals or as individuals. And so it's important to have civil society voices who prioritize respect for human rights as a part of that conversation as well. And that maybe leads me to my current job. And my current job is as the global executive director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, GIFCT. And that my role at GIFCT is to be a convener to bring together what we call that multi-stakeholder platform that brings together government, civil society, tech companies, academics, and not just in the United States, but from all around the world, and that we can ideally use this multi-stakeholder environment to develop better whole of society approaches to counterterrorism rather than just looking to government and saying, government, what are you going to do about this topic? And I guess I would say that was the big revelation as I left government after 27 years of government, Roz, was that, yeah, it was great to be doing what we were doing in government, but we were going to be limited in our impact, particularly in the online space, if we didn't also find a way to work with technology companies, civil society, and a whole host of other actors who live nowhere near Washington, D.C. And I think that's my big takeaway from my couple of years of post-government life, is that many of those solutions are to be found outside Washington now, not inside Washington.
Yes, I think that's a really good segue to let's talk a little bit, maybe a bit more about the role of industry for a moment. So, we've just seen the rise of huge, powerful tech companies. They preside over these massive social media platforms. They have billions of users around the world. And I think actually GIFCT, right, was the sort of effort, when I think it was 2016, 2017, somewhere in there.
Exactly. It was the brainchild of four of those big companies coming together and saying, we can do stuff together on this.
Right. And then it was kind of more formalized as a nonprofit. But I think there's still, and I was going to kind of go there for a moment, which is a lot of Americans still find the inner workings of these companies to be a bit opaque, maybe a little, sometimes, I don't know, suspect, just don't quite understand their interests. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these companies are approaching their responsibility to monitor online content? What makes certain content a legitimate target for censors? How are they sort of thinking through freedom of expression versus public safety? And if you can, I know it's hard in your position, but what should they be doing better?
Great questions all. And again, there's no single picture or portrait across the technology industry right now. Each of these companies has its own terms of service, its own means of applying those terms of service. Each has its own capability, whether it's hiring thousands and thousands of content moderators who can be 24/7 in front of screens trying to knock down or take down content that's violative of their terms of service. But you range all the way from those down to smaller applications in which there is no content moderation capability. And so it's much harder for those companies to kind of deal with terrorism or extremism on their platforms. So you've got really a tremendous range. There's no one place, where this terrorist or violent extremist activity takes place in the online environment. What you can say, though, is that there are some companies that have begun to invest in solutions in terms of building their own capacity to deal with that kind of content, and to come to the table via organizations like the one I'm a part of, GIFCT, to have that kind of cross company lines conversation about what can we do about these things. So the kind of thing that usually companies who are seeking competitive advantage against each other don't do a lot of collaborating and cooperating across company lines. But this is one area where they are in fact trying to do so and sharing best practice, trying to find lessons learned for each other. The easier part of this problem set, and none of it's easy, but the easier part of the problem set, Raz, is when you're talking about something that the government has declared to be illegal. So for example, if you or I wanted to go on Facebook and post something that cheerleads Al-Qaeda and says that Al-Qaeda is awesome and is poised to capitalize on the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we somehow self-identify as being sympathetic to Al-Qaeda or wanting to even represent Al-Qaeda, chances are the platform would very quickly look to take our material down. Why? Because if we are aligning with Al-Qaeda, a designated terrorist group, so said by the United Nations, so said by the United States of America via various statutes, governments have that clean, clear set of guidelines that they can say, aha, that material violates our terms of service because it's illegal, and it will come down. Therefore, the easier part of the conversation for tech companies is when something can be attached in a pretty linear way to a terrorist organization that the government has declared to be a terrorist organization. The gray space is when you get to what seems like, or what is, violent or extremist speech that isn't tied to a designated group or isn't tied to a group structure that you can say, aha, the government has declared that to be illegal. And again, many, here in the United States, for example, we do not have a domestic terrorism statute. So a group like Proud Boys, for example, which might be subject to designation as a domestic terrorist group, if we had such a statute, it actually has been designated as such by the Canadian government. And so therefore anything that happens in Canada tied to Proud Boys would be deemed illegal. It's just that gray space area where tech companies lack the same predictable framework that comes with illegal proscription or prohibition from the government. That's where you get what you described in your question, which is a much more spotty performance, where companies are having to apply their own judgment, sometimes well, sometimes poorly, sometimes in a delayed way. Or, something is sometimes brought to their attention and they address it on the back end after it's been brought to their attention. And again, when I was hired approximately 16 months ago, one of the things the companies that I work with said to me was, help us work better in this gray space. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, is find ways to think about categorization and definition of content that is not tied solely to a group listing or a group name. Because again, bad guys and terrorists know how to work around the rules. And so if you want to be an Al-Qaeda member, just don't call yourself an Al-Qaeda member if you want to stay online. So again, this is not me making excuses for tech companies and their inability at times to deal with this toxic online environment. I'm just explaining somewhat the challenge that comes when you lack kind of clear, predictable, government-provided legal frameworks. And so many of the companies, for example, would welcome more instruction from government, not just the United States government, but from around the world, that says that group, those people, that kind of content, because then it takes it out of the zone of optionality for them, and they can address it more confidently.
I think I'm going to follow up on that question, but a little bit later, because I want to ask you a little bit more about domestic extremism. So I think I might hold my question about a little follow-up to what you just said. Let me move before we kind of come back home to domestic extremism. Let me go abroad for a second. And we're maybe 10 minutes away or so from kind of going to Q&A. So I'm just going to remind people, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. But let's talk a bit about, I mean, you've mentioned several times, and I think it's probably pretty obvious, right? But you can't just restrict your monitoring of online activity to what happens in US borders. It has to be, it's a global phenomenon, and that ability to monitor has to go pretty global. But that raises lots of issues in terms of kind of national authorities versus, other nations' authorities. And countries around the world have very different capabilities. They have different motivations when it comes to disrupting or dismantling extremist networks. So we need cooperation when it comes to meeting this threat. And I'm sort of curious what you think of in terms of prospects for global cooperation when it comes to trying to coordinate some of this activity worldwide. Are there places and territories, maybe Afghanistan would be something we could talk about at this moment, that seem to you like a very difficult place to operate, to coordinate, that strike you as particularly risky for the US?
So the kind of international cooperation you're talking about, Roz, is sometimes, as you know, you start with the set of friends or partners or allies that you can work most closely and comfortably with, because you generally align with each other in terms of values, traditions, respect for the rule of law, of course, being one of those traditions. And so you tend to be able to work in concentric circles outward when you're thinking about action in this environment. Not surprisingly for the United States, and this goes back to my government career more than my post-government career, the most productive conversations where you could take action together in these areas usually started with what we call the Five Eyes countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all English speaking, all democracies, all focused on rule of law, adherence to rule of law principles. And so we could enter into the conversations about things like what to do about regulating the internet, or what to do about dealing with questions tied to freedom of speech or freedom of expression. We could enter into those conversations with largely aligned worldviews, and therefore you could reach common ground more quickly. The more you widen that concentric circle, the harder it gets to kind of reach any kind of joint view on literally anything. I'll give you an example. I was in London about 2-3 weeks ago to attend a meeting of the G7, the group of 7 nations, which includes US, UK, European Union, Italy, Japan, Canada, France, and Germany. And if I left somebody out and annoyed them, I apologize, but that's the G7. And the G7 home ministers and interior ministers, in our case, it was the Secretary of Homeland Security, were meeting to talk about a bunch of shared problems, corruption around the world, immigration challenges around the world. Well, they devoted an entire session to the stuff I work on online extremism and technology, and the technology environment. And you had powerful voices in that room asking companies to do more, get involved earlier, take more content down, be more aggressive in sharing information with law enforcement. And yet you had some of those same countries around that table saying, okay, we agree with that, but whoa, we don't want to do too much of that at risk of violating people's civil rights, violating people's rights to speak, securitizing problems that are not necessarily solved by security measures alone. So even in a like-minded group like the G7, you had very different shades and nuances of view about how much pressure governments should be putting, for example, on tech companies. One or two of those countries, or several of those countries in Europe, have actually dictated, you tech companies must take content down of a certain sort within 1 hour of its appearing on your platform, or else these penalties attach. Well, you would not see a similar measure, I suspect, passed in the United States, because we would see that as likely producing overreach, and companies in response to that would probably end up censoring way too much content. So even inside the community of democracy-loving Western countries that work most closely together, you get a wide, diverse array of views about how to manage this problem set. And that just tells you how hard it is if you widen the circle to include the Russias, the Chinas,
Yeah.
imagine, and I see that's a question that comes up from one of our guests, Mark. How do you bring them into that conversation when they don't share the same value set that we share? That's another big challenge for public policymakers.
Yeah, I thought we might get to that question too. So it's interesting we both saw that. So civil society, which you mentioned, and I think that's I think it's really important to talk about, and I think that it's also a bit fuzzy. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about, I mean, GiveCT has committed to strengthening the ability of civil society to play a constructive role. What do you think civil society can do? Can you break down what is civil society? What can civil society do? Are there steps, I mean, just for individuals, like the ones in the audience, should they be taking action? What do we do?
It's a great question again, because it's the area where my learning curve, I would argue, is the steepest, because my government life did not prepare me for the kind of daily engagement with civil society organizations that I often have now. And again, it goes back to some of what I've said already, which is if you were just putting government and tech together and saying, solve this problem, chances are they could, there'd certainly be measures they could come up with together that would shrink the amount of extremist and terrorist content in the online environment. But as I've said earlier, a lot of that would come at cost. It would come at the cost of violating principles and fundamental rights that we hold dear. So who should represent that set of voices, that set of issues, that set of perspectives in this conversation about strategy and policy? Well, it has to be civil society organizations. So I have a number of civil society organizations that can engage with me pretty directly, who, I don't want to say that they kind of put brakes on what we do, but they serve as an important countering voice, or sometimes a voice of conscience about ways in which you want to make sure that you're taking a 360-degree look at a problem before you seize one solution or another to try to solve the problem. So, and then your question about, like, does that leave scope for individuals or even very small civil society organizations? The answer is absolutely yes. And I'll give you just a very vivid example. Back in April, I participated in a global summit of the Christchurch Call to Action Network. The Christchurch Call to Action emerged in the wake of the horrific Christchurch attack in New Zealand in 2019. You and your guests may remember the attack on mosques and the Muslim population of New Zealand, where you had multiple mosques attacked by an individual with a firearm, dozens of mosque attenders murdered. Well, in the aftermath of that, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, and the President of France, Macron, came together and issued the Christchurch Call to Action that called upon government, technology, civil society, and the private sector to all work together better to address this problem that we're talking about today. It was in effect the first real call to create that multi-stakeholder environment that I've been talking about. And we had this summit back in April that brought that community together after 2 years post Christchurch, the 2-year anniversary of the attack. And you had a Zoom screen like the one we're looking at here. And on that Zoom screen, you had Macron and Ardern, you had Boris Johnson from the UK. President Biden couldn't attend at the last minute, so Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, represented the United States. You had 20-some heads of state in very little tiny boxes, like a Hollywood Squares box like this, but equally you had 6 or 7 tech executives from the very biggest tech companies. Equally, you had 6 or 7 boxes apportioned to voices from civil society, including some individuals who lead up NGOs that you could fit into one small conference room, 10 people or less, but who were important voices in this conference. I took a screenshot of that Zoom on my computer that day because to me it was emblematic of what it is to be bringing civil society into that conversation. Because at that conference, at that summit, the head of a small human rights organization focused on protecting free speech got as much airtime as any head of state. He or she was as important a voice as a tech CEO, a prime minister, or anybody else. And so I printed off that screenshot. It's kind of a reminder to me of the kind of environment we're trying to create. Now, when you create that environment, it's kind of like radical democracy sometimes. You can't do everything by committee, and it's sometimes very hard to generate consensus when you have that many diverse voices in the room. And that's why the kind of multi-stakeholder, whole of society problem-solving approach that I'm talking about is not easy, and it's often very frustrating, and you end up having to spend a lot of time listening to people who you may not agree with. But that's how you get at shared solutions to some of these problems, is through that process. At least that's what I've come to believe.
So this, I think, so the Christchurch is a good example. It's something that happened abroad, horrific, and bringing a lots of heads of state together, counterterrorism experts, et cetera. So I'm going to go to an audience question, and I'm going to blend it in with something I'd wanted to ask you anyway. This is from somebody who had pre-submitted a question. So it's from Ruben Dibner, and he asked, it's very simple. I'm going to put this up front, and then you can think about it while I finish the question. How can we avoid another January 6th? So that's kind of a lot to digest. But I think what I want to ask you is, can you tie back the point you were making about extremists being amplified? So I think there's a connection between small groups of extremists, right, who latch on to bigger, more activist groups, right? And there's this odd intersection between, hardcore extremism and activists online, and that can kind of spill into or create some very complex dynamics when you get to the ground, right, on a day like January 6th.
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit about that, the extremism versus activism, where they intersect in not particularly, constructive ways, how that contributed to January 6th? Are there things we can be doing to dampen down the effect of, or the role that extremists play and their ability to kind of like amp everything up?
Sure. And again, January 6th was a traumatic moment for most Americans, to be sure. And I just got back from overseas, and I literally, a taxi driver in a European country say to me, I never thought I would see the day when I would look on TV and see people storming the US Capitol. And I sat there embarrassed. I had nothing good to say to him. What do you say to that? I just shrugged my shoulders and agreed with him. But I think the experience of January 6th, I think, helps us think through how we prevent recurrences of that, though I don't know that we'll ever be entirely successful at anticipating how something can morph from something planned and safe to something spontaneous and unsafe. But I do suspect, in fact, I probably can say with certainty, that my colleagues in government now are doing a much more thorough job of monitoring what we would call open source intelligence. It's not just informants or wiretaps or gathering information on known or suspected terrorists or criminals that governments now do, our government now does. It's monitoring the open source environment so that you can have some tipping or cueing indication that an event might draw the kind of extremist response that we saw on January 6th. And I think you saw that just a couple of weeks ago with the almost rally here in Washington, D.C., where I'm located, that was going to be arguing for the interests of those who've been incarcerated in the aftermath of January 6th. Well, that turned out to be kind of a nothing burger. If you remember the news reporting from that day, there were more journalists and spectators than there were actual protesters. I think that was for a couple of reasons. Well, because government had signaled that they were aware of, watching, monitoring, and on their front foot in terms of preparing a security response. And that had a tremendous, I think, deterrent effect on individuals who might have wanted to do something, but who thought, well, wait a minute, all I'm going to do is get arrested. All I'm going to do is find myself in a situation where I don't advance my cause because we've all been arrested. So that's not unlike what we would often see with traditional terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. They can be at times deterred from taking specific action if they see that there are measures in place to respond to that action. It doesn't put them out of business. It doesn't take them out of their extremist mindset, but it often leads them to say, not today, maybe another day. And that's not a bad thing. That avoids violence, it avoids destruction, and it gives law enforcement another opportunity to get inside that organization at a later point and prevent future activities from happening. So I think you'll see from our government in Washington and around the country a much more front foot response to monitoring the online environment for the kinds of intelligence indicators that you and I would have expected to see in government in classified channels, but now they're available in unclassified, what we would call open source channels. How the government takes advantage of monitoring all of social media is a complex question filled with lots of different legal and ethical challenges, and I won't propose to answer that here. But I know our Department of Homeland Security, our FBI, our other intelligence agencies are all thinking hard about those questions.
Good. So I am going to move to the Q&A, and so people can feel free to keep going in there and putting things in. I think I'm just going to go with Gavin Sullivan's first question because I think there's a nice segue. So you just mentioned, the difficulty between freedom of expression and the public safety, and those two, core values or core priorities that the government has. He's asking, how can governments and platforms cooperate to work better in this gray space? And he notes, and I had wanted to ask you anyway, about the hash sharing database. So maybe you could talk about that work stream that you're doing at GiftCT. And he adds, what added value can governments bring in this problem space when the online infrastructure is largely privately controlled?
Great questions. First of all, the hash sharing database is one of the concrete information sharing pieces of work or work streams that I inherited when I took over GiftCT last year, in the summer of last year. The companies, the four founding companies of GiftCT, had already begun this work before GiftCT was stood up as an independent NGO. And what this hash sharing was a means through which companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, the big founders of GiftCT, could identify material that might be on their platforms that could be called terrorist in nature, flag it, hash it. Hashing it means, in this case, applying a 25 or 20 some digit digital hash, a unique fingerprint-like identifier of digits, putting that into a shared database, and then other companies could access that database. And if they bounced their holdings off that database and saw a match between the hash of 20 some digits and anything on their database or anything on their holdings, they could say, aha, that's a piece of terrorist content. I should be alerted to that. I should do something about it. So think of it in its most simplistic terms. If Facebook takes down a piece of material out, say Osama bin Laden was publishing, or Al-Qaeda surviving members were putting up a video of bin Laden, Facebook would take that down, obviously, but they then apply a digital hash and put it in the database so that if the same kind of video were to appear on Twitter, Twitter would have access to that database and wouldn't have to go find that video on its own through its own policies and processes. They would get a triggering alert that says, hey, this video is appearing on your platform as well. So that hash sharing database is a means of speeding or making more efficient, by information sharing, the ability of companies to respond to material tied to terrorists. Where that works well, and this gets to Gavin's questions, where this works well is, as I said earlier, where you've got really sharp, crisp definitional frameworks. No one's going to argue or give you a hard time if you take down material tied to Osama bin Laden. Everybody gets it. Everybody knows what that is. It's terrorist content. The gray space material is harder. We haven't yet cracked the code, in my mind, within GiftCT on how to manage the gray space material in the terms of our hash sharing database, because you won't get all of these companies in one fell swoop to agree 100% on what would be violative, what would actually violate each of their terms of service when it comes to far right or medium far right. Everybody will bring a bit of an eye of the beholder to this. So absent the government providing that framework of a definition or a proscription framework that says these groups are illegal, this speech is illegal, it's just going to be harder to make the gray space work in a multilateral setting like a hash sharing database. Now, we've taken some steps in that direction. We recently took a step and agreed among ourselves at GiftCT that we would hash all terrorist manifestos that we come into contact with, that anybody finds. So imagine so the New Zealand attacker was not Al-Qaeda, was not ISIS. He was someone who was anti-Muslim. He didn't belong to any group, but he published a manifesto. And so you don't have to, if he's published a manifesto and he has attacked and murdered people, You don't have to have a debate over what he is or who he is. He's already told you who he is or what he is. So now if that manifesto were to appear on any of the GIFCT member companies, it would potentially be hashed and shared so that everybody could take it down as expeditiously, as quickly and efficiently as possible. That's a small step, but it's moved us beyond having to label something as Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of the other designated terrorist groups. I hope over the next year we can do a much better job of doing more grace-based definitional work so that we can expand the reach and the impact of this database. But right now we're not there yet. It's a hard conversation in the gray space.
Yeah, I think that relates a bit to another question that's here, which is from John Barnowski. He wrote, a nebulous but important question is, how do we account for the immense range of individual human motivations? So individuals make very local interpretations and local decisions, education, religion, culture, mental health, peers, politics, et cetera, all discussion in this area, terrorism seems to address systemic and cohort level problems. So I think he's sort of asking, how do you go from, typologies and think a little bit in more nuanced ways, maybe about individuals, if that's possible. And I thought maybe it might be good to add or ask you to elaborate a bit on this human rights-based approach that GIFCT has tried to articulate, and whether that's related to this. So over to you on that.
Yeah, it's a great question because it kind of gets right to the heart of how you can potentially over succeed or overachieve in the effort to get terrorist content offline. Because you can easily, I can give you a number of scenarios that kind of get to John's question about how what's on the internet is actually context specific. So for example, you might have a piece of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State or other known terrorist material posted, but it's posted in the context of mocking or posted in the context of an effort to de-radicalize an individual, or it's posted in the context of an effort to preserve evidence for some kind of future law enforcement case against propagators of that material. But if you were taking a kind of rigid one-size-fits-all approach that says anytime you see something labeled as Al-Qaeda or ISIS and it's online, it needs to come down, it needs to be struck from the platform, well, then you would overachieve and you would miss out, you would be denying individuals their right to post what you in many ways would argue is healthy material aimed at producing a positive result. And so this puts a lot of pressure on companies to try to interpret what is the actual motivation of the individual posting the material. And sometimes it's obvious if that person is exhorting or encouraging people to take violent acts. There's no gray space there. That violates most of their terms of service provisions. And so they'll act against that. But if they're holding up terrorist content for some other purpose, for either analytical purposes or as part of a debate about what public policies should be pursued, or as I said, in an effort to engage in de-radicalization of individuals by mocking or debunking particular narratives put forward by extremist organizations, well, all of a sudden you've engaged in a whole lot of nuance in terms of the motivation of the individual posting the material. And if you've got too blunt a scalpel, you will fail at leaving that kind of material online, and you will have choked off important conversations that should be allowed to carry forward. And so that's exactly where GIFCT is trying to find this sweet spot where we can have that conversation about how to get that content moderation process as precise and tailored as possible. And to the CSO, civil society organization perspective that we talked about earlier, Roz, having their voice at the table as you have that conversation is what holds you to account for what I just described. And so making sure that they're allowed, and not only allowed, but welcomed at that table so that they can say, no, wait a minute, you need to be thinking about it from another perspective. That's the value I place in the civil society engagement.
Good. So maybe we'll move a little bit toward more geopolitical, see if there's like a link we could make maybe between some tactical issues and some strategic issues. So one, when monitoring, this is from Patricia McLaughlin, she asks, when monitoring open source intelligence, are we seeing any connections with foreign governments or actors? So there's all the little noise and pitter patter and individuals out there. And then are there, when do we need to worry that they're being driven or motivated by or somehow orchestrated by larger state actors and state forces? How does that come into all of this?
Perfectly appropriate question. One I think I would have a much better handle on if I were still in government and reading in the classified domain. Because again, I can sit here outside government now and say, I suspect or I intuit that this form of online engagement is actually being masterminded or at least catalyzed by a foreign government actor because they're trying to act against the interests of the United States or some other country. I can suspect that, but I often won't have evidence to back that up unless I have the other side of the equation kind of behind the curtain that we would have had in government. Because in government, our traditional intelligence means of collection would allow us to be able to gain insight on motivation and capabilities of a government like Russia or China that might be seeking to engage in influence operations here in the United States. And again, all you need to do if you want to read between the lines on this is look at some of the publications that our intelligence community has put out in the public domain in the aftermath of 2016 and 2020 elections, where they talked about the issues of foreign influence on our elections. As you know, they used very carefully guarded language in talking about how we knew what we knew, but it was very clear the implication that there was a clear consensus within the intelligence community that Russia was seeking to manipulate the ways in which Americans thought about their politics and thus their electoral behavior. And so that's something I can see from outside government in open source intelligence, and I can kind of intuit that that's true. But the validation and the confirmation that that's actually happening, I think happens when you marry that information in open source with what government is able to collect in traditional intelligence collection, where they can either get a human source or some kind of technical collection that allows them to say, aha, we know that that government, or we have a high confidence that that government is in fact acting against our interests in that way. So I wish I had the full picture that I used to have on that, but I don't.
Yeah, no. Well, actually, on the Russia-China, maybe we could move to Mark Maybury's question, which was, what can the US and allies do to better counter Russia and China's regional and global influence campaigns that combined with economic and military actions risk destabilizing countries? So I think there's maybe two questions in here. You've talked a little bit about the influence campaigns, at least directed at the West, but can you talk about the influence campaigns that might be directed more at some of their near neighbors? I mean, how much do they get involved in and maybe Afghanistan or countries of interest in their own peripheries? And how do they operate in those environments? And how worried should we be about their ability to destabilize a place unexpectedly that might create spillovers for us?
Yeah, I mean, one of the classic examples I think of in the context of that question, in terms of their near abroad, their immediate closer in countries around them, is what Russia engaged in with Ukraine some number of years ago, where they sought to destabilize and undermine the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Did that in all of the traditional ways, military pressure, economic pressure, etc. But they also did so with some very often unsophisticated online campaigns that were just very, in some ways, ham-handed and very obvious. The fingerprints of the Russian government were often pretty obvious and available for all to see, but nonetheless put pressure on and were one additional factor in the effort to destabilize and undermine a legitimately elected democratic government. We could, again, I was still in government for some of this period, and what we lacked was effective counter response to that. Like many aspects of asymmetric conflict, your options are sometimes limited in terms of how you counter that particular form of activity. Yes, you can try to identify individuals who are involved and create sanctions regimes against individuals who can be tagged as participating in that kind of work. But short of how do you go from there to sometimes other measures that might be more effective that would be much more escalatory, potentially involving, kinetic force, are options that we weren't willing to pursue. Nobody was willing to make Ukraine that issue between the United States and Russia that would potentially lead us into conflict. And as you know, there was a robust debate in the latter years of the Obama administration and certainly in the Trump administration about how much we should be providing in terms of arms to Ukraine in order to allow them to be able to defend themselves against Russian aggression. Well, similarly, I suspect there was also a whole lot we were trying to do to bolster Ukraine's capabilities to respond to Russia across these other domains as well. We just wouldn't necessarily know as much about that. So, but like any aspect of asymmetric conflict, it's hard to pick the right tool to respond and figure out how are you going to actually deter Russia from engaging in this behavior. Yes, you want to do it. You want to choose those tools in a way that will increase the cost to Russia, but you don't want to do it in a way that leads you down an escalation path if you're not prepared to follow down that escalation path. And if it goes tit for tat, where would we end up? And unfortunately, Russia has taken advantage of that inability I think we have to kind of match tit for tat an escalation framework and continue to engage in the kind of behavior we're talking about in Ukraine. And that's just one example, but I think it's a pretty illustrative example of the kind of influence that you're talking about.
Yeah, and actually, maybe we could spend just a minute on China, because I think, we're kind of a little bit more familiar with the Russian online activities. It's sort of more directly linked, but China is a very, very capable technology actor as well. Also has huge technology companies with which US companies increasingly have to compete. So can you maybe address the potential for conflict around this issue of online, I guess, extremist activities that might be either promoted or kind of dampened down, right, with the kind of controls that the Chinese government have? Does that put us into conflict with them? And how do the Chinese tech companies kind of fit into some of what we've been discussing?
Well, the conversation with China actually comes at this in some ways from a different direction sometimes, at least the policy conversation from the United States government. In some ways, the Chinese, because of the way they run their authoritarian society, use their grip on technology inside China's borders to shut down or constrain what we from the United States or the Western perspective would view as legitimate opposition voices, tied to ethnic groups like the Uyghur Muslims in the southwestern portion of China. The Chinese declare those to be terrorist groups, terrorist individuals, and therefore use that as blanket permission or blanket rationalization for any efforts to shut down online activity by such actors. We view that as authoritarianism, in its purest form, because we don't define those actors to be terrorists by definition. With China, that I think the issue is sometimes more complicated also because they are less overt, I would argue, at least from my understanding, less overt than the Russians are in terms of seeking to exercise the kind of direct reach into the politics of other countries and nations by use of the online environment. The Chinese, of course, use the online environment in a very sophisticated way as an intelligence gathering mechanism. And by intelligence gathering, I mean both traditional forms of intelligence, but also economic intelligence. And the Chinese use their control of technology and technological infrastructure to be able to gather as much intelligence as they can about intellectual property, technology that may be beyond their reach today. And so I worry about that much more in the Chinese context than I do about the kind of traditional misinformation, disinformation work that we've been talking about in the context of Russia. So both bring very big challenges to the United States in the online environment, but slightly different flavors of challenge, I would argue.
Good. Well, we have like just a couple minutes left, so I thought maybe we could just end with something that would be fairly easy, but also a little forward-looking, which is kind of what do you have planned at GIFCT over the next year? If we kind of came together in 12 months, what would you like to have on that list of things that you said you'd accomplished there?
two things primarily. One is a better answer for you on some of this gray space stuff I've been dancing around for the last 30 or 45 minutes, because I know that's an area of work we've got to do better, where not just me, but all of us, government, technology companies, civil society, finding more effective ways to at least agree on broad frameworks for thinking about what kind of material is illegitimate or even illegal and should not be allowed in the online environment. That's hard stuff, but I hope we have a better answer than we have today on that. And the second one, I hope I bring you a better metric on a year, if I were doing this a year from now, is more companies. Because it's one thing to bring Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft together, Google, and I've got 17 companies total working together in this space. But the world is every day a new app, a new company, a new platform appears in which bad guys can potentially use it. And it's not just social media. We've tended to kind of focus on social media, but I'm actually kind of proud that one of my newest members of GIFCT is actually Airbnb. Airbnb is not a social media company. I think everybody knows that. But Airbnb is a service provider, and yet they realized that their service was potentially at risk of being utilized by people who were terrorist or violent extremists. Some of you New York Times readers may remember reading in the New York Times after January 6th, how a lot of the people who flowed to Washington, D.C. to participate in the activities on January 6th, they just made rentals on Airbnb the way they would if they were going on vacation anywhere. And Airbnb clearly does not want to be that platform, or be the platform that any extremist uses for whatever purpose. So I don't pick on Airbnb at all. I actually say kudos to Airbnb for embracing the idea that they can help be a part of solution driving in this space. But a year from now, I hope I've got 10 more companies around the table doing that, and not just 10 American companies. Yesterday, we did an open house, a Zoom open house for an hour to invite companies in who we think might benefit from being part of this collective effort. And I hope a year from now, I could point to at least a half a dozen or another dozen companies who are playing a role. Because any company that does that, at least by one measure, signals that they're serious about doing something about it. And there's plenty of other companies that aren't serious about doing this because there's too much money to be made by letting things just be free and uninhibited on the internet. So as much as you want to criticize the companies that are at the table, they're at least at the table. And I would hope there are more companies at the table a year from today, and not just from the US, but from around the world.
That's great. Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Nick. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. It was really fun. I was excited to hear all your thoughts on this, and you answered all of our questions very patiently. So I really, really appreciate it.
Terrific audience, I will say. So it was a great set of questions.
Good. All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the security forum, and hopefully see you at a future event at WAC-NJ as well.
Thanks all.
Bye.